Stop the world!
But ultimately, if that country wants to arrest somebody and make them into a diplomatic pawn, they will.
I think loud, noisy diplomacy increases the political pressure. It gives diplomats the kind of political weight that they need to engage in negotiations.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm Justin Bassey, filling in for David Wroe, who is actually featuring on today's podcast.
It's great to have you in the host seat, Justin, and it couldn't have been timed any better, because this week the podcast is all about arbitrary detention and press freedoms, topics that you're extremely passionate about.
Yes, we have a double header for our listeners, with two interviews featuring Peter Greste and Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who have both been victims of wrongful detention and are now two of the strongest advocates for both freedom of speech and countering this practice, which is unfortunately on the rise.
First up, Dave Wroe interviews distinguished journalist and author Peter Greste on arbitrary detention, the recent prisoner swap between the US, Russia and other Western countries, and global trends in media freedoms.
They discuss advocacy strategies and the effectiveness of quiet diplomacy versus public campaigning, as well as whether there are common threads between those people who are being arbitrarily detained.
A lot of journalism, perfectly legitimate, important journalism, is cancelled or dumped. A lot of whistleblowers, a lot of sources are frightened off because they're simply afraid of the consequences. And I think that is a serious problem.
Well, that's probably too much from us. Over to Dave and Peter.
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Wroe. I'm delighted to be joined today on the podcast by award-winning foreign correspondent Peter Greste. Peter's had a long career working for the BBC, Reuters, CNN and Al Jazeera in some of the world's most difficult places, from Afghanistan to Latin America, Africa to the Middle East. And while reporting for Al Jazeera from Cairo in late 2013, Peter and two of his colleagues were arrested, falsely charged with terrorism offences and imprisoned. This prompted a global outcry and a campaign for their release, but Peter nonetheless went on to spend well over a year behind bars, and sometime beyond that campaigning for the release of his two colleagues, which was eventually successful. We wanted to speak with Peter today, partly to explore the broader threat of arbitrary detention and hostage diplomacy, but also to talk about press freedom. After his detention in the Middle East, Peter has spent much of his time and energy as an advocate for press freedom. Over the same period, we've seen several high-profile wrongful detentions of Australian citizens, including Kylie Moore-Gilbert in Iran, Cheng Lei in China, and Sean Turnell in Myanmar. We also, of course, still have Dr. Yang Hengjun detained in China. Peter, there's no one better than you to talk about these issues, so welcome to the ASPI podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, David. It's great to be here.
Let's start with your story. The accusations against you were clearly preposterous, as you said yourself at the time. I actually remember reporting on this as a journalist on your case at the time. My distinct memory is that you and your colleagues were caught up in a kind of regional power play involving Qatar, the home of your then employer Al Jazeera. What's your best understanding of what you're being able to unravel about the circumstances behind your arrest?
So there was always a lot of speculation. A lot of people had assumed that rivalry between Qatar and Egypt was the primary reason why we were arrested. I struggled with that for a long time. I finally came to the conclusion, I've got no particular evidence for this beyond the circumstantial, but I came to the conclusion in the end that if the Egyptians wanted to make the case for Qatari malfeasance in Egypt, if they wanted to prove or make a point that somehow the Qataris were meddling in Egyptian affairs, then it made no sense to come after an Australian who'd only been in the country for 2 or 3 weeks, who spoke no Arabic, who had no particular connections with the Muslim Brotherhood. Basically I was the last person that you'd choose if that was the main issue that you were looking to prosecute. So I think this really was about press freedom. It was about sending a message to journalists, whether they were local or foreign, that you will not speak to the opposition. You won't speak to the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they were still, arguably the most potent political force in the country. They chose us, as me and my colleagues from Al Jazeera, because I think we were politically convenient, because we fitted into the narrative that you've just outlined. But ultimately, as I said, I think this really was about press freedom more than it was about that rivalry between Qatar and Egypt.
Right. Do you think it was successful? What have you noticed about press freedom since that period?
If it was to silence the press, then it's had a very, very effective, it was a very effective strategy. There is very little press freedom in Egypt at the moment. I mean, ours, of course, wasn't the only arrest. There were quite a lot of others. In fact, Egypt remains one of the most prominent jailers of journalists. There aren't any other foreign correspondents that they have behind bars at the moment. But Most foreign correspondents have abandoned Cairo as a base for covering the Middle East, as a base for covering the region. Those that are there, I think, are fairly careful about how they cover the government. So yes, I think it has been pretty effective.
Yeah. You raised the point about convenience. I mean, there are a couple of strands to the seizing of journalists, to the arbitrary detention of journalists. I mean, one is obviously the press freedom. Authoritarian countries have a natural interest in quashing press freedom and sending a signal that they don't enjoy the scrutiny that journalists bring upon them. But at the same time, where foreign correspondents are concerned, they're an easy opportunistic target because the host government can view them as, well, they're in the country, they're safer to grab than, say, a diplomat from another country, which will bring all sorts of bilateral consequences immediately. So, sometimes perhaps they are just convenient citizens of a foreign country who are there. And plus they have a public profile. So if you want to bring some pressure to the other government, then a high-profile journalist is an obvious target. I mean, in the cases that you've surveyed internationally over the past sort of years, decades. Obviously, there's Evan Gershkovich recently in Russia, and we can see probably elements of both of those strands there. I mean, what do you see as the balance between those two things?
Look, I think it's both of those things. And I think the kind of story that I outlined in Egypt probably applies in cases like Evans as well, and Chang Lei's and others, where, as you say, it's easy to portray journalists as spies. They carry notebooks and cameras and they ask questions and they go to sensitive places pretty much as people who you might expect are conducting espionage might do. And they are high profile and they work for companies who have the capacity to put pressure on their home governments. But I also think there's an element of hostage negotiation, of hostage diplomacy, of taking these people hostage and using them as pawns in negotiations for some kind of concessions from the country that you're aiming to target. But yes, they also conveniently send a message to other journalists that you need to be very careful about how you report. I think these two things are probably true. Again, we don't have any particular evidence beyond the circumstantial, but it's happened enough and in enough countries for that to seem like a plausible explanation for why journalists keep getting arrested.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the natural opacity of authoritarian regimes does make it hard to always discern the exact motives. You'll have informed people in either camp trying to sort of read the tea leaves of what's going on. Now, in Evan's case, thank goodness, we've just recently seen his release in the past week or so. It was a large prisoner swap between Russia and the West. So there were 24 prisoners freed in the multi-country exchange in Turkey, as well as Evan. There was the former US Marine Paul Whelan. Russia released 3 American citizens, 6 other Western prisoners, 4 political prisoners and human rights advocates, and 3 Russians with ties to Alexei Navalny, the sadly deceased democracy campaigner. The West released 8 prisoners. Not all of those being arbitrarily detained in Russia were released in the swap. And of course, a few regimes use detention and swaps as strategically as Russia. But I'd be keen for your take on this recent swap and I suppose more broadly the risk that by agreeing to such swaps, democratic countries encourage or, bring greater incentives to authoritarian regimes, whether that's Iran or Russia or China, to continue using arbitrary detention as a tool to coerce the West. I mean, what do you think the risk is that you're creating incentives?
A couple of things to be said about this. First of all, I don't think there was any alternative, really. I mean, from the moment that Evan was picked up, it was very clear that the only way that he would get out would be through negotiation, through some kind of deal. And President Putin pretty much said that explicitly when he spoke to Tucker Carlson, the American journalist, in a now infamous interview from earlier this year. There are plenty of regimes. The Iranians are another one that use prisoners, highly transactionally. And so governments are in a real dilemma here that if they want those people out, there's really no choice but to negotiate, to do a deal. So I think this particular prisoner exchange raises the likelihood that we will see more. That makes it incredibly difficult for governments who don't want to put their citizens at risk, who don't want to have to make these kinds of deals in future. And so I think the international community, as much as I hate that term because it means something, everything and nothing, but the international community collectively is going to have to figure out a strategy for tackling these kinds of situations. I think there are a number of moves at the moment. The Canadian government has started an initiative on hostage negotiations, on hostage diplomacy, what they call the arbitrary detention of foreign nationals in state-to-state relations. A real mouthful that phrase is, but effectively what it means is a group of countries getting together and agreeing to put collective pressure on countries that take individual hostages. That places pressure. It takes away the cost to any one particular country. No country has to pay an enormous price individually, but collectively they can put enormous pressure on the offending country. And they can take away the pressure to engage in one-on-one negotiations. That won't necessarily solve the problem on its own, but I think it could act as a powerful deterrent. That kind of initiative is underway. We haven't seen it making huge strides, but I think that is the kind of strategy that we're going to have to look at if we want to see these kinds of practices stop.
It's a terrific initiative, and I suppose it raises the frustration that we always feel when multilateral and multi-country initiatives are proposed and then take an annoyingly long time to come to any kind of fruition. How do you see the progress on that one?
I think it's been relatively slow, as you say, but I think this hostage deal, this prisoner exchange deal, will probably help move things along. I think it points to the need for it. I'm pretty sure that it would have been very difficult for the US and other countries that were involved in the prisoner exchange to swallow the idea of giving up people who've been accused and convicted of some pretty terrible crimes. I mean, the Germans had to give up a Russian agent who was guilty of murdering a former Chechen rebel in the middle of Berlin in broad daylight. That's a pretty horrific thing to do, and I think it would have been very difficult for the Germans to let him go free. And I'm pretty sure that they won't want to have to do that again. They won't want to be in that kind of position. So it's quite likely that we'll see a lot of conversations taking place, if they're not already happening, about some alternative kind of collective approach to hostage diplomacy.
Yeah. Your case was obviously very high profile while it was going on. Evan's case was also high profile. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, ran a strong campaign on Evan's behalf. I remember every time I would go to the Wall Street Journal website, which was pretty much every day, there would be a spot on their homepage with the latest updates on Evan. So they obviously decided that making a lot of noise about it was the preferable approach. Where do you stand on that balance between strong vocal campaigning by the home country and by their supporters and the old quiet diplomacy? Because obviously quiet diplomacy has worked in some other cases, and I think that's demonstrated to be the case. Where do you stand? Or is it a case-by-case thing?
We'll never know the counterfactual. I mean, we don't know whether it might have happened sooner rather than later if the Wall Street Journal had basically kept its mouth shut. I think each case is different. Each country is different. Each individual detainee has got different circumstances. The metrics are always going to be different. And so I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis. But having said that, I think that government's instinctive reaction is to go for quiet diplomacy initially. I understand why that's the case, but I also don't think it's necessarily the right approach. I think loud, noisy diplomacy increases the political pressure. It gives diplomats the kind of political weight that they need to engage in negotiations. I remember after I was released, both I and my colleagues, bizarrely, were still technically on trial, on a retrial in our case. And I was talking to some European diplomats about how we could help get them out. And they said, keep going with Facebook and Twitter, keep going with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, keep talking about this publicly. And I said to them, look, the Egyptians don't care about Facebook and Twitter, and they certainly don't care what Human Rights Watch says. And they said, you're right, the Egyptians don't, but I care. And because I care, it gives me the political weight that I need to go into my meetings with my Egyptian counterparts and say, listen, you have to fix this problem because I can't normalize relations with you until you do. We can't get on with normal business until this issue is resolved because I am under pressure. And I think there's real truth in that. There's real value in that approach. As I said, I wouldn't say it's necessarily universal. There will be circumstances when quiet diplomacy is better, and it's probably safer to shut up and let the diplomats do their negotiating in peace and quiet. But I do think, in my experience and the experience of a few others, Kylie Moore-Gilbert is another, I know is a very strong advocate for noisy activism rather than quiet diplomacy. And I'm pretty sure that both she and I and many others would still be behind bars if it weren't for fairly vocal supporters.
Absolutely. I was in the Foreign Minister's office when Kylie was being held by the Iranians. And yes, I knew all about the vocal and high-profile nature of the case. And again, to the credit of all involved, I mean, it was a good outcome with a lot of hard work from a lot of people. And,
just on that, there is one other thing. My family made the point too, and I remember this very clearly. They said that they felt that the Egyptian government was capable of making the distinction between the messaging, the kind of carefully nuanced messaging that was being delivered in closed diplomatic meetings, the equally carefully calibrated messaging that my family was making in public, and the real, rabid noise, often quite racist noises that were coming out of social media. But they felt that ultimately what it added up to was collective pressure to get this resolved and resolved quickly in ways that if everyone had shut up wouldn't have happened. Now, as I said, it's impossible to know the counterfactual, but I tend to agree that they're right as well.
And you can do the various strains simultaneously. You can do the quiet diplomacy and also
exactly
the public.
It is possible to run those in parallel without seeing the whole process fall apart.
Sure. I mean, on the subject of Kylie and some of the others who've been through the same experience, you've been part of setting up the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance, along with Kylie, Sean Turnell and Chung Lei, otherwise known as AWADA. I've actually just noticed that your acronym is uncomfortably close to WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, which has been getting some rather negative press recently. So just make sure that you distinguish yourself from them. I mean, obviously that indicates, it's a reflection of the prevalence of this practice and this activity. I mean, just tell us a bit about AWADA. What are the aims? Why did you want to sign up to it?
Because I feel there is a need for stronger independent representation for people that are being detained arbitrarily overseas. I think that we wanted to provide a resource to the government and to families of those detained to help give them some advice and support. We've all collectively been through quite a lot, and we've got quite a lot of experience in these things. Our families do too. And so we know how difficult it can be, how isolating it can be for the families who are trying to navigate these things, which very few people, fortunately, have to go through. And so we felt there was real value in setting up an organisation that has the capacity to provide that support, but also give advice to governments on how to negotiate. And sadly, we also recognise that it's happening more and more often. And even though there aren't that many people in total numbers, it does seem to be increasing. And so we felt that there was real value in an organisation like that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the aspect around families. We had Kylie and a couple of the others here to help launch AWADA back a few months ago. And certainly one of the things that I hadn't really thought about that much was that impact on families. And, who do they look to? Who do they turn to for advice and support? Now, obviously, DFAT or the relevant department of another country can provide some, but, big government departments aren't always in a position to give that sort of warm personal experience and personal touch, as much as they're working hard to solve the problem. But that family aspect is a really fascinating one.
Yeah, and the diplomats, have very clear limits to what they can say, and there's kind of support that they can give, and there's a degree of there are limits to the emotional involvement that they can offer. And they don't have the first-hand experience of what it's like to be personally involved in these kinds of crises. I've found that and I've spoken to quite a few families who've been dealing with hostage diplomacy, and I know that they find it often, hugely comforting to have someone who knows and understands exactly what it is that they're going through and who can offer some help and advice and support. And even if there's nothing particularly practical that we can do, at least an understanding, sympathetic ear is really valuable.
Peter, you devote most of your time these days to press freedom issues and advocating for press freedom. Just give us your take on the state of press freedom, I suppose, internationally. I mean, especially in some of the key hotspots where perhaps we've come to take it for granted and perhaps it's going backwards, regrettably, or places that we haven't traditionally associated press freedom with and, maybe getting even worse than they have in the past. Just give us a sense of that.
Unfortunately, press freedom around the world has been pretty bad and it's getting a whole lot worse. I think the turning point was 9/11. What we saw in a lot of the conflicts pre-9/11 were wars largely over tangible things that you could literally put your finger on, whether it was land or water, ethnicity and so on. And in those kinds of conflicts, it was always risky for journalists, of course, but we weren't necessarily participants in the conflict because it wasn't a war of ideas. But what 9/11 did was create a conflict over ideas. The war on terror became a battle between Islam and the ideas of Western liberalism. And in that conflict of ideas, the media became a part of the battle space, that area where ideas are transmitted. And I don't think this is an abstract concept. We saw a lot of journalists being targeted by both Western governments and by Islamists. But also, crucially, the war on terror, that idea of the war on terror, gave governments around the world the language that they needed to pass all sorts of draconian legislation that used national security as an excuse to come after uncomfortable journalism. Now, that's exactly what happened to us in Egypt. The government used loosely framed anti-terrorism laws to come after journalism that they felt was uncomfortable. And we're seeing this reflected all over the world. The world's greatest jailer of journalists, China, is imprisoning most of those journalists on terrorism, on national security grounds. Those journalists are mostly Uyghurs who've been trying to cover the oppression in Xinjiang province. Turkey is another of the most prominent jailers of journalists, and there too, most of those are there on national security charges. In fact, the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, has done an analysis of the charges that journalists around the world are facing, and they say that between 2/3 and 3/4 of journalists of the charges that they're facing are what they loosely describe as anti-state charges. So that's things like terrorism, treason, sedition, crimes against national security, and so on. And that narrative has continued. More recently, we've seen a lot of other statutes being used against journalists. But broadly speaking, I think that national security framework has been one of the most serious, most compelling reasons why press freedom has deteriorated in recent years. And Australia, we're actually pretty serious as well. We were enjoying a high point on the World Press Freedom Index published by Reporters Sans Frontières of around 18th position out of a total of 180 countries on their index. That was in 2018. We've since slipped to 39th position on the World Press Freedom Index, and that is largely because of the really aggressive national security legislation that our governments have passed since 9/11. We've passed more national security legislation, in fact, than any other democracy on earth. Almost 100 separate statutes that have been passed since 9/11. And not all of them intrude on press freedom, but one of the problems that we have in our country is that we don't have any constitutional protection for press freedom or freedom of speech. And that means Parliament is under no obligation to consider the impact of those laws on press freedom when they're passing them. And similarly, the courts have no obligation to interpret the laws in ways that protect press freedom. And so as a result, what we see is a lot of what some of my academic colleagues have described as the chilling effect on public interest journalism. Now, it's very difficult to quantify the stories not told because of the way that those laws are operating, but they work the way that the laws are supposed to work, and that is to act as a deterrent. And so I think it's indisputable that a lot of journalism, perfectly legitimate, important journalism, is cancelled or dumped. A lot of whistleblowers, a lot of sources are frightened off because they're simply afraid of the consequences. And I think that is a serious problem. So whether it's globally or here in Australia, I think we're seeing a pretty serious situation when it comes to press freedom. And as I've said earlier, it's not getting any better.
Well, that's a perfect opening to talk quickly about the potential solutions for that, Peter. Your work with the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom, and I'll wrap up with this final question. One element of your work is to look at a Media Freedom Act for Australia. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, we don't, because we don't have a constitutional protection for press freedom. We're not likely to get a constitutional amendment through our laws anytime soon. And so we think there is the model that we can take from the Human Rights Acts in Queensland, the ACT and Victoria, which basically say three things. They say that Parliament, the state parliaments, always have to consider human rights when they're passing new legislation. The courts have to interpret existing legislation in ways that are consistent with human rights. So that even if the law doesn't say that it's okay for the police to lock up a 12-year-old, the police still can't lock up a 12-year-old. And that public servants have to act in ways that support human rights. And we think if we replace the words human rights with media freedom, then we're actually in the ballpark of where we need to be at a Commonwealth level. It effectively establishes the principles of press freedom in law in a similar way to the effect of a press freedom amendment to our constitution without actually having to go quite that far. The one thing I want to emphasize, though, David, is that even though we've been talking about press freedom and journalistic freedom and so on, this isn't really about the press or about journalists. This is about the public's right to know. This is about democratic accountability. I know that a lot of people are very cynical about journalists and journalism. There's not a hell of a lot of political support for journalists these days.
Slightly less popular than politicians.
Yeah, exactly. And so I want to emphasize that, this isn't about journalists. This is about the public. I think there's a great quote from a French philosopher who once said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad.
Mm-hmm. Very wise. Look, fascinating issues. I wish you well with it. Peter, these are incredibly important topics, I guess, in a period in which we're seeing democratic backsliding around the world and also rising geopolitical tensions, which is increasing the incentive for some of these behaviours like hostage diplomacy. So, look, it's a really important conversation. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's been a real pleasure.
Next up, ASPI DC intern Tasfia Zeba interviews Kylie Moore-Gilbert, writer, academic and co-founder of AWADA, the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance.
They discuss Kylie's experience of being wrongfully detained, whether there's anything Australia and other governments can do to deter this practice, how governments can more effectively respond when it does happen, as well as the importance of Magnitsky sanctions.
Over to Tasfia and Kylie.
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm Tasfia Zeba, coming to you from ASPI's Washington DC office, where I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert, a distinguished scholar in Middle Eastern Studies, Director of Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance, also known as AWADA, and a committed human rights advocate to the victims of wrongful or arbitrarily detained abroad. We just finished a private roundtable with Dr. Gilbert and wanted to continue our conversation with her to better understand what Australia can learn from the US on how to deal with arbitrary detention cases. Dr. Gilbert was imprisoned in Iran in 2018 on fabricated charges of espionage, serving over 2 years before being released in a prisoner swap deal. She has since published a best-selling memoir titled The Uncaged Sky and currently serves as a research fellow in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at the Macquarie University. Dr. Gilbert, it's an honor to have you here and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tasfia.
Of course. Could you start by sharing a bit about your experience of being wrongfully detained in Iran and how it has shaped your views and path towards advocacy on arbitrary detention?
Gosh, so like most people, I think I had no idea about this subject prior to my detention in Iran. I'd never given it any thought whatsoever. And, most people think when they travel abroad and they hear stories about horrible things that might happen to tourists or visitors or business people or whatever, that'll never happen to me. And if it does, my government will come to my rescue and it'll all be okay. So even though I knew Iran was a nasty authoritarian regime and it did horrible things to its own people, as a scholar of the Middle East, you kind of just accept that, well, if you're going to travel anywhere in the Middle East, you're probably going to have to visit such a regime. Liberal democracies are kind of few and far between in that part of the world. So I never really thought that it would impact me as a visitor. Obviously, what happened to me in Iran, and, I was charged with these ludicrous espionage charges and I spent 2 years and 3 months in prison. I had received a 10-year prison sentence and I was ultimately used as a diplomatic bargaining chip in negotiations with the Australian government to see my release. That coloured my whole understanding of this issue of wrongful and arbitrary detention and what's been called hostage diplomacy. It gave me to understand that this is not an isolated phenomenon that just happened to me, that it affects a large number of people from all kinds of different countries in all kinds of different places around the world. And that in the West, we're not actually doing a very good job at tackling or disincentivizing the practice. In fact, sometimes we enable it and reward it through our actions and our decisions. And that's really difficult because, hostage diplomacy, it's a real conundrum. It's a moral quandary that, governments are increasingly having to grapple with. What price can we put on our own citizens' lives? And what are we prepared to do and what are we prepared to give up to secure their freedom? There are no right or wrong answers here. And we only have, to make the best of several bad options, I think. So with AWADA, with the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance, myself and my partners are looking at this issue from a macro perspective, how do we encourage the Australian government to take a leaf out of the book of the US and Canada too in seeing how to address this issue? What policies can they put in place to disincentivize state hostage taking, as well as at the more micro level? So how do we support the families of people who are taken hostage or arbitrarily detained abroad? How do we rehabilitate the person also when we bring them home? Australia doesn't really have any measures in place for that rehabilitation or even debriefing people necessarily. It kind of happens on an ad hoc basis. So how do we look after that person's welfare when they are brought home, and how do we support families who are often very traumatized also and, going through hell when that loved one is detained abroad? So my own experience has, fundamentally shifted my view on this subject and led me to help create the Australian Wrongful and Arbitrary Detention Alliance to try and deal with some of these big issues that states are increasingly grappling with.
Thank you so much for the answer, Dr. Gilbert. Kind of just following up on that, since our focus for the roundtable today was on what Australia can learn from the US regarding arbitrary detention, from your perspective, what are some of the effective strategies that the US has employed in dealing with such cases? And what are the specific policies do you believe have been notably ineffective in addressing or preventing such instances in both the cases of the US and Australia?
It's a really good question. And the US hostage recovery enterprise, which it's called, is huge. It's complex. Yes, it's bureaucratic. There are a lot of stakeholders involved. There are a lot of agencies involved, but it exists. And this is an important fundamental starting point because we do not have such a thing in Australia. There are issues with the US system. I'm in touch with the families of current and former US hostages and other NGOs working in this space, so I'm aware of some of the issues. But from an Australian perspective, the fact that this issue is prioritised in the US and that a lot of resources are brought to bear and attention is given from the perspective of government to bringing American citizens home, this is something that we would love to see in Australia. Australia does bring its citizens home, and there have been quite a few notable cases in the past couple of years, particularly since the Labor government came into power, that they are prioritising the issue. They have brought Australians home from captivity abroad, but we don't have any formalisation of the process, and so people do slip between the cracks. Looking at the US, looking at the Levinson Act that was passed in 2020, which sets out the process by which an American detainee abroad is designated to be wrongfully detained or a hostage, and then what resources and which government agencies are responsible for helping that person be freed. That is set out in this act of legislation. Thereby, the government has a duty to secure the freedom of those people. We would love to have that in Australia because currently it's at the discretion of government and to what purpose resources are devoted. And unfortunately, we do have cases where people have fallen between the cracks or the government has not sort of paid them any attention for years, perhaps until the family goes to the media, and that media attention and pressure forces a political decision to make consular, for example, take notice and try and secure the person's release. So looking to the US, I think we could certainly look at a similar act of legislation in Australia, perhaps different and more suited to Australia's Westminster system of government and the particularities of our context, but some kind of act of legislation would be great, as well as developing a similar enterprise to the US concerning a particular office or a particular individual tasked with the role of securing the freedom of wrongfully detained Australians abroad, and that set of criteria and determining factors that would lead us to have a process of figuring out which of the many thousands of Australians arrested abroad each year are wrongfully detained and whom we should be advocating for diplomatically to secure their release.
Thank you for the answer, Dr. Gilbert. I'm curious to know about the multilateral coalition being formed to address these issues. The US has applied a Magnitsky-style sanction broadly in such cases, and Australia has something similar in place as well, though it appears to lack significant impact. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of such measures?
That's a really good point. So you're right. We do have Magnitsky-style autonomous sanctions in Australia. And AWADA has called for such sanctions to be applied to wrongful detention cases. So known repeat perpetrators, individuals in countries like Iran or China or Russia or Myanmar that take Australians hostage. And this would apply to non-state actor groups, criminal gangs, terror groups, because Magnitsky sanctions are targeting individuals, not countries, right? So travel bans, asset freezes, and also that important kind of naming and shaming factor, because many of the people involved in state hostage taking, no one knows their name. There might be officials in the regime. They're never mentioned. They've never been called out diplomatically or internationally for their actions. So it does have that important kind of symbolic factor attached to it as well. We've been calling for the government to impose Magnitsky sanctions on state hostage takers. For example, in my own case, the names of some of the mid-level judiciary officials, judges, and even interrogators involved in my wrongful detention and prosecution in Iran, they're known. Why couldn't we sanction these people? Some of them have been involved in the kidnappings of other Australians as well. I'm by no means the only Australian who was wrongfully detained in Iran. Similarly, in the case of Sean Turnell, for example, the academic and economist that was arrested following the military coup in Myanmar and thrown in prison for a number of years there. We know the names of the officials involved in his case. We haven't sanctioned Myanmar by far enough by international standards also in Australia. Why on earth aren't we sanctioning some of those people? So I think there's a role to play for Magnitsky sanctions. Often it's only symbolic, but it is still important. And this is an area that I think the Australian government could look at. It is a human rights issue, fundamentally, and Magnitsky sanctions would be very well suited to being one tool in the toolbox of disincentivization measures that we could use to tackle wrongful and arbitrary detention.
Thank you so much. This brings me to my last question. This is just to wrap up the entire interview. Based on your experience, what are the recommendations would you make for Australia that can improve its responses to this situation? And I guess you already kind of answered this question, but are there any specific legal reforms or diplomatic strategies that you believe could be effective in preventing such cases in the future?
Preventing cases is a really, really challenging area, but I do agree with you. It's important to focus on this too. DFAT in Australia and other foreign ministries in Western countries do a lot of work in trying to alert their citizens to travel risks and dangers that might exist in certain countries. And I'd note, as a result of my detention in Iran, DFAT added to their travel advice on Iran, for example, the risk of arbitrary or wrongful detention or hostage diplomacy should you travel to that country. So it's important for governments to alert their citizens to that risk. That being said, it's unlikely to deter people from travelling there. They might be more aware that this could happen to them and maybe take countermeasures during their travels, but ultimately if that country wants to arrest somebody and make them into a diplomatic pawn, they will. And because Australia and the US and many other countries, we're multicultural societies, we have a lot of dual citizens who have family ties, cultural ties, religious ties to countries abroad which might undertake this practice. It's not feasible to ban everybody from travelling to Iran, for example, or travelling to Russia or China when they might have strong links to those countries. So I think education and awareness raising about this issue is really important, but prevention can only go so far. And I think if a country is intent on taking foreign citizens hostage for diplomatic leverage, it's going to find those people, no matter how aware we might make them of the practice.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for sharing your insights and experience with us today in this podcast. It was an honor having you here with us today.
And to steal Dave's line, that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening.
We'll be back with another episode next week.